Hello, everybody, and welcome to part three of Causes of the Civil War. We are not going over too many years today. We're going to start in 1854 and go to 1856. But the events that took place from 1854 to 1856 were monumental in helping to cause the American Civil War. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So let's start off in 1854. In that year, one of the most consequential laws in American history was passed. And this law was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the first thing I'd like you to do is take a look at this map I have right above my head here. And if you look at this map, you'll see that, let me change the color here for us. We all remember this Missouri Compromise line. So when Missouri was admitted as a state, basically they said the bottom border of Missouri for the future is going to determine whether new states are slave states or free states. So Kansas and Nebraska were going to be located up here. So basically that means that according to the Missouri Compromise, both the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory are going to be added to the country. And according to this old rule, basically there's going to be no slaves there. But during this time in history, a lot of people realized that because there is so much unsettled land in that former Louisiana Purchase territory, you can't let it all come in as free states. Because once again, you go back to that whole balance between free states and slave states. So there was one guy who really wanted Kansas and Nebraska to come into the country. That was this guy, Stephen Douglas. You might remember his name, right? He came up as one of the guys who helped push the Compromise of 1850 through. And he had his own interests in mind. So in his mind, he said, if we can find a way to settle Kansas and Nebraska, then if we go back to our map, we can create a railroad line that goes from Illinois all the way to the West Coast. You can't build railroad tracks if the land on the rail line is unsettled. So because Stephen Douglas was from Illinois, he said, I got to find a way to pass a law to get Kansas and Nebraska into the country. Okay? And that kind of part about the whole transcontinental rail line is mentioned right there. Okay? So the big idea with the Kansas-Nebraska Act is this idea of popular sovereignty. So instead of just saying, you know what, Kansas and Nebraska are going to have no slaves, they decide that basically they're going to allow the people who move to those places to vote whether they want slavery or not. So if they vote yes, they have slavery. If they vote no, they don't have slavery. So the idea was Kansas and Nebraska, let the people vote. Okay? So part of this Kansas-Nebraska Act was the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. So that law that had kept America united since 1820, that law was gone, wiped off the books in one foul, swoop. So basically what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did was it created the possibility that slavery could exist in the North. So a lot of Northern people kind of see the writing on the wall and realize that if we don't do something to stop this Kansas-Nebraska law, you're going to have slavery all over the country, including the North. This law was so controversial and so contentious, the Democratic Party split into two. The people in the North who opposed it, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the people in the South who supported it. Even worse, and this is like a big picture, put a big star next to it, right? The Whig Party, the party of Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, that party broke up and never got back together over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party is officially done. So in this political cartoon that we see on the screen, we see a number of things. Okay. First thing we see is the artist depicts a bunch of politicians, specifically a bunch of congressmen, right? And these are the congressmen who are, basically passing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In this part of the political cartoon, we have a black man who's depicted as a slave. And I would say the most jarring part of the cartoon is you have a man, right, who is having these politicians, quote unquote, shove slaves down their throat. So the saying to shove something down someone's throat is often a phrase used when somebody forces something upon you. So the artist of this cartoon was basically saying that if you move to a place like Kansas or Nebraska, these politicians may force you to live in a place where they have slavery. So the greatest political effect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the destruction of the Whig Party, and out of the ashes of the Whig Party rose a new political party in America to rival the Democrats. And this is the modern day party that we call the Republican Party. So in 1854, because of all the Northern outrage over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a group of former Whigs and former Know-Nothings and former Liberty Party and Free Soil Party, they all get together and say, all right, let's create a new political party, and that is the party today that we call the Republican Party. Okay? I want to skip down to where, sometimes the Republican Party was called the Anti-Kansas-Nebraska Party. So basically, the Republican Party brought together all the various groups of Northern people who thought it was a bad idea, for various reasons, to have slavery in Northern places. So in 1856, the newly formed Republican Party ran their first ever presidential candidate, a man by the name of John Fremont. So in the Electoral College, the Republican Party, in their first ever election, won 11 out of 16 northern states. Now, some very shrewd political operators at the time did some math and said that if we can win about 3 or 4 more of these northern states, that'll basically be enough to elect a president. So in 1860, the Republican Party kind of thinks like, all right, what states did we lose in 1856? And who can we run in 1860 to win those states, right? And the reason why Abraham Lincoln is picked to be the Republican nominee in 1860 is because he is viewed as a guy who can win those states that Republicans lost in 1856. All right, so what did the Republican Party stand for? The Republican Party opposed the expansion of slavery. Now, this is important. The Republican Party did not oppose slavery. There were some people in the Republican Party who were abolitionists, but most Republicans argued that slavery should continue where it exists, but it should not go anywhere new. So the whole mantra or the whole saying of the Republican Party is we support free labor. So we don't think that people should be relying upon slaves to do work. White men should do work, right? So there's a saying here, free soil, free labor, free men, right? It's also important to note that the Republican Party did not exist in the South. So the Republican Party was a Northern-only political party because people in the South wouldn't be caught in their right mind believing in what the Republicans believed in, right? So in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln runs for president, you can't vote for Abraham Lincoln in the South, even if you want to. He wasn't on the ballot. That's how unpopular the Republican Party was in the pre-Civil War South, right? So basically, let's highlight at the very bottom here. This is a Northern-only party, very important, right? And basically, the argument that the South made was that Republicans only care about the North and they don't care about the interests of the entire country. Okay. In 1855, because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, there were a lot of problems and specifically violence in the new Kansas territory. So Kansas opened up to settlement, and what happened was you had pro-slavery settlers who crossed the border into Kansas from Missouri. And then you had anti-slavery free staters who moved to Kansas to try to make sure that slavery did not become legal there, right? So what happened was, because they were going to have a vote on slavery, basically each side, the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery side, knew that the more people they could get on their side to move into Kansas, the more likely they would have, the ability to change whether the state either had or didn't have slaves. So what happened was, there was a lot of election fraud. There were a lot of violent raids, assaults, and murders by these two separate groups who basically set up their own towns and formed their own militias. Some people actually consider this violence in Kansas to be, the beginning of the Civil War. Now, I wouldn't go that far, but basically what Bleeding Kansas shows you, okay, is that about in the 5 to 7 years prior to the Civil War, basically Northerners and Southerners, they were fighting, attacking, and killing each other over the issue of slavery, okay? So basically, even before the Civil War starts, pro and anti-slavery people are injuring, attacking, fighting, and murdering each other in the Kansas territory, which basically shows you that in a larger sense, Kansas almost became like a foreshadowing for the war that was going to take place between the North and the South. So here's a famous painting of the pro and anti-slavery sides going at it in Kansas. Okay, so you probably see on this side, right, you see the American flag, right, and you see kind of this group on the left, and then you see another group on the right that's supposed to represent, the pro-slavery side, right? But what your eyes are probably drawn to is this guy here. And one of the most prominent anti-slavery settlers in Kansas, his name is John Brown. And John Brown is one of these figures in history. He goes down in history as a radical. He's a guy who, he only likes two things in life. He likes the Bible, he loves his Christianity, and he hates slavery. So John Brown is a guy who moves to Kansas along with some of his sons in order to fight against, physically fight against these pro-slavery people. Now, the event that John Brown is most associated with in Kansas is something called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. There's one particular night where John Brown knocks on the door of a couple pro-slavery households. Brown and his men drag these pro-slavery guys out of their cabins and then murder these men and then hack their bodies to pieces with swords. So in the years after Bleeding Kansas, John Brown kind of becomes like a runaway, a fugitive from the law. His name is printed all over in newspapers. And he's viewed as a guy who is one of the most radical anti-slavery minds in America. And as the painting shows, in one hand he's got his gun, in the other hand he's got his Bible, and John Brown was famously known as saying that, and predicting that the only way that slavery was going to end in America was through violence and through warfare. And even though he was an extremist in his day, his prediction ended up being accurate. Okay, so this next event in 1856 is an example of violence that took place in the halls of Congress. So not only is there fighting going on, physically fighting in Kansas at the time, but pro-slavery and anti-slavery politicians actually went at it from time to time. So in the U.S. Senate, you had a Democrat, a pro-slavery man, Preston Brooks. He heard a speech in the Senate that was given by Senator Charles Sumner, who was a Republican. And Preston Brooks was so upset by what he heard in this speech that basically Preston Brooks went over to Charles Sumner and violently beat him with his cane. So much so that Charles Sumner was basically on the ground, couldn't move, and it took him months to recover and even get back, months to get back to regular functioning. In the aftermath of the event, people from all over the South sent Preston Brooke canes. So basically, they saw him as a hero, and the North saw Preston Brooks as a villain. Okay? So the reason why we consider this important to the coming of the Civil War is that usually congressmen are these guys who they just argue with words all day. But the issue of slavery was so personal to these men that they couldn't even argue like civilized gentlemen about it. They couldn't even keep their composure when the topic of slavery came up, right? So it's kind of a breakdown of civilized behavior, right? Slavery is an issue that it's very clear that, the time for compromise is over. So previously, we talked about an event in Kansas called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, right? Our very anti-slavery abolitionist, John Brown, murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers in Kansas in cold blood, hacked up their bodies, and then basically left. So John Brown kind of developed a reputation as being a murderer, right? But Brown's argument was that he murdered for a cause, right? He murdered so that slaves could eventually have their freedom, and he thought that if you were a pro-slavery person, you were a sinner, okay? So what this event really represents is the coming radicalism. Some people said that, hey, the time for words is over. The only way these pro-slavery people are going to listen is by getting attacked and by being killed. So in 1856, the presidency of Franklin Pierce was coming to an end. The presidency of Franklin Pierce was basically defined by incompetence. Franklin Pierce, as president, should have never signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and really, Franklin Pierce should have done more about the violence in Kansas. Pierce did not do that. So in 1856, America needs a hero. And instead, what America got was another awful president. Okay? The Democrats ran James Buchanan. Now, here's the thing about James Buchanan. I have a hard time thinking about a president in American history who was more qualified and did more things prior to becoming president than James Buchanan. He was in Congress. He was a governor. He was in the president's cabinet. He had literally held every important government job that a politician could have. Now, the ironic thing about Buchanan is he ends up winning this election, and historians, I would say probably 80 to 90% of the time, rank James Buchanan as the worst, not like a bad president, the worst president in American history. Okay? So a little bit later on in our next segment tomorrow, we're going to kind of figure out what was it about this guy James Buchanan that made him an awful president. Now, running against James Buchanan was John Fremont. The significance with Fremont was that he was the first presidential nominee put forth by the newly created Republican Party. And then last but not least, Millard Fillmore ran for president on an anti-slavery kind of platform as a third-party candidate. Okay, so let's briefly conclude here today by discussing some of the reasons why James Buchanan fails. It was pretty aware to most people that the violence and the escalating events that were happening between the North and the South over the expansion of slavery was slowly breaking the country apart, right? And we needed a president who was going to solve our problems, to take a firm stand. And what James Buchanan is mainly known for is he's unsuccessful in handling this crisis between the North and South, right? We needed a gung-ho president, and instead we got another one of these guys who just wanted to defer to Congress and just kind of avoid the trouble, avoid the drama, okay? So we know, looking at the years between 1856 and 1860, that not only was Buchanan an awful president in that he didn't do much, but some of Buchanan's presidential actions, including what he did regarding the Kansas problem, actually made the Civil War come quicker. And that's not something that you want to be known for, okay? So we really needed military intervention to kind of keep the peace and to really keep the sections of the country, together, but also cooperating with the laws of the country, right? Buchanan was so afraid to use the military. He's afraid to be either too pro-slavery or too anti-slavery. And sometimes when you don't pick a side, you pick no sides. So basically, Buchanan, when the South eventually does leave the country, by far his worst act as president was that when the Southern states left the country in 1860, our president, James Buchanan, did nothing. Buchanan did absolutely zero, and he said, I disagree with the South's, decision to secede. I don't think it's legal. But Buchanan also said, there's nothing I can do about it. So we're just going to wait till Lincoln steps into power, and we'll let Lincoln handle the problem. So because Buchanan is such a coward through the Kansas fiasco and through the secession fiasco, that's why historians regularly rank him as the worst president of all time. Okay, guys, that concludes part 3. I'll be back shortly with part 4. And then, of course, we have a quiz on the causes of the Civil War early next week. I will see you then.